Hello, I'm Michael Golden, KM8YOR, and welcome to Mayor's Ham Shack. Today we're going to talk about Part 1, Section D of the Technician License Exam. This is more on the Commission's rules, so the FCC rules specifically. All the answers can be found in the Part 97 section. If you just search for FCC Part 97 rules, you should come up to a page, likely the ARRL page, and you can download it, read it yourself. It's about 50, 60 pages, so it's not incredibly massive, but still pretty big. So understanding the questions and the basic rules by memorizing those questions will actually help you a lot in generally not breaking the rules. If you can memorize these, you'll remember most of them when it comes time to transmit. And I would also like to keep in mind that generally you're not going to get the book thrown at you unless you're a complete jerk about it and just keep breaking the rules. So there's 11 questions in this section, and Section D is all about the authorized and prohibited transmissions, communications with other countries, music, exchange of information with other services, indecent language, compensation for operating, retransmission of other amateur signals, encryption, sale of equipment, unidentified transmissions, and one-way transmissions. So I'm going to read the questions and we'll talk about them a little bit. There's not a whole lot to talk about on some of these questions. It's just memorization. It's just, hey, this is the rule. But I'll try to add a little extra insight when I can. And then the second part of the video, I will just read the question, give you a few seconds to think about it, and then give you the answer. That'll help you more when you're studying right before the test to try to make sure you actually know the knowledge. So let's get started. And by the way, if you like this content, please give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and if you have any feedback, positive or negative, as long as it's constructive, please feel free to leave comments. I try to listen to them best I can. Had a gentleman say that, hey, the audio wasn't loud enough, so I'm hoping the audio's a little better now with the coming videos I have coming out. Here we go. So question 1 in this section. With which countries are FCC licensed amateur radio stations prohibited from exchanging communications? A. Any country whose administration has notified the International Telecommunications Union (ITU) that it objects to such communications. B. Any country whose administration has notified the American Radio Relay League that it objects to such communications. C. Any country banned from such communications by the International Radio Union (IARU). Or D. Any country banned from making such communications by the American Radio Relay League (ARRL). So the first big thing that jumps out to me in this question is we have the ITU, the ARRL, the IARU, and another answer about the ARRL. The IARU and the ITU are extremely important organizations that are above the FCC in a sense. The FCC directly interacts with that, sort of like a United Nations for radio. The ARRL, on the other hand, is a lobbying organization within the United States and only for the United States. So right away, they don't directly make rules or tell us what to do. They help guide the FCC. They might lobby for a particular rule change, but they're not involved in actual rule making or determining who we can work with or not. So right away you can eliminate the ARRL because they are not a government agency. So the next one is the ITU and IARU. The International Telecommunications Union has a lot more power in this section. They generally run the main part of this. The IARU is sort of a group of countries put together to sort of continue communications and things like that. So the answer here is the ITU. Any country whose administration has notified the International Telecommunications Union that it objects to such communications. So they're saying they don't want to be involved, and it's not just it's not just the United States. It's like they don't want any amateur radio communication at all. Second question. Under which of the following circumstances are one-way transmissions by an amateur station prohibited? A. In all circumstances. B. Broadcasting. C. International Morse code practice. D. Telecommand or transmissions of telemetry. So what we have to determine here are, how do we determine a one-way broadcast or a one-way transmission? So one way is, I'm saying it out, it has no direct main contact, possibly for many people, and possibly for none at all. There are situations where it is allowed. So right away we can eliminate A, in all circumstances. One-way communications are allowed, and there's one big one here that we're gonna talk about in just a second that is very important. So broadcasting. Now, broadcasting, and we're going to talk about this in another question. Broadcasting is to the FCC is when you're talking and your signal is going out to everyone in the world, and you have no direct target. It's for everybody in the general public, almost like you're having your own radio show and stuff like that. So we're going to keep an eye on that one for a second. Let's talk about C, International Morse code practice. C is actually highly encouraged. So you can do one-way transmissions for International Morse code practice. Let's keep in mind now that you don't want to be interfering with anybody. You don't want to be somewhere where someone is trying to make a communication, things like that. So you want to find a quiet area to do that. A lot of times people connect dummy loads, so their signal isn't going out anywhere. It's just staying right there, right into the dummy load. If you're not sure what a dummy load is, that's okay. We'll talk about them more soon. But they pretty much, it's instead of having an antenna, you have this little device that's a dummy load, and it just sucks up all the electricity and dissipates it without it affecting anything. But International Morse code practice is highly encouraged. You can get a lot of different devices that can do that, and you're actually using your radio to get the job done. And D, telecommand or transmission of telemetry. So this could be GPS type information, it could be signal information, stuff like that, beacons, or you're trying to tell a airplane, quadcopter, drone, or even a space station directions, instructions on to do something. That is allowed as well. So that leaves with broadcasting, and that is the correct answer. Broadcasting. You are not allowed to just talk in the radio and have no specific target or anything like that. Just going out in the air, talking about whatever you want. You're not supposed to do that. That's actually considered detrimental to the hobby, and don't want to do that at all. 3. When is it permissible to transmit messages encoded to obscure their meaning? A. Only during contests. B. Only when transmitting certain approved digital codes. C. Only when transmitting control commands to space stations or radio control craft. Or D. Never. Now, when we talk about encoded messages, we could talk about anything as simple as Morse code. Could be considered an encoded message or language. When you're making comments, so like if you say, hey, make sure you have the cupcakes ready when I get home, and you're really talking about some sort of drug or something that you want to take, or things like that, that is not allowed. So if you have special code with a spouse or somebody and you're talking to that person, you're not allowed to use it. If other people don't understand what you're talking about and doing, then you can't use it. But there are certain types of encoding, more like computer encoding, that you are allowed to do. So you have a Morse code that you can use. You have many of the different digital modes that are quote unquote encoded, but they're encoded in a way that does not obscure their meaning. You have an easy and understandable way to extract that information and get it, and anybody can get it. It's not something special that you've set up so nobody understands what you're doing. So only during contests, no, that's not allowed. Only when transmitting certain approved digital codes. um, I, I'm not sure I understand where they're getting at there. Um, but there's no like quote unquote approved digital codes that obscure meaning. So any approved digital codes you can easily use, and everybody can use to decode your message. So there's not really an obscured approved digital code. So that one is wrong. That's kind of a herring in there. Uh, Try to ignore it as much as possible. The key thing that you need to know is you are allowed to use codes and commands to control space stations and radio controlled craft, and other things like that. So you can do C. 4. Under what conditions is an amateur station authorized to transmit music using a phone emission? A. When incidental to an authorized retransmission of manned spacecraft communication. B. When the music produces no spurious emissions. C. When transmissions are limited to less than 3 minutes per hour. D. When the music is transmitted above 1280 megahertz. So the big thing to know and understand here is this question is very much specific to the IIS, and maybe now, even now that we got some of these other private manned spacecrafts, kind of interested to see how that plays out, as far as this particular question. But in the IIS, they will oftentimes have music playing in the background, very tight. So, and other things are going on. They're doing experimentations, things like that. So when they're on the radio, sometimes there's music in the background. That is allowed. This specific rule is about them. So the correct answer is A, when incidental to an authorized retransmission of manned spacecraft communications. Big way to remember this: music only for manned spacecraft. Music only for manned spacecraft, and then you'll get that question right. 5. When may amateur radio operators use their stations to notify other amateurs of the ability of equipment for sale or trade? A. Never. B. When the equipment is not the personal property of either the station licensee or the control operator or their close relatives. C. When no profit is made on the sale. D. When selling amateur radio equipment and not on a regular basis. So again, not too much discussion need to have here. The rule is pretty simple, and the correct answer is D. When selling amateur radio equipment and not on a regular basis. You can't sell your car, you can't sell your kids, you can't sell your house. If you have radio equipment that you're selling, yes, you can sell that, and you can talk to people about it. Again, you don't want to go broadcast like, hey, I'm selling this, call me with phone numbers, stuff like that. But you're welcome to have conversations with people, say, hey, I have this for sale, are you interested? And they'll say yes or no, and you can go on like that. As long as it's not on a regular basis, now you're there literally wheeling and dealing amateur radio equipment to anybody who will listen to you. 6. What, if any, are the restrictions concerning transmission of language that may be considered indecent or obscene? A. The FCC maintains a list of words that are not permitted to be used on amateur frequencies. B. Any such language is prohibited. C. The ITU maintains a list of words that are not permitted to be used on amateur radio frequencies. Or D. There is no such prohibition. So if you've ever been on CB radio, you know that there's a lot of seedy things going on there, and not always a whole lot of fun if you're not into that kind of stuff. Much of it can be considered indecent or obscene, and not everybody, not every CB operator is like that, but it's certainly out there. It's certainly potential run into it. Amateur radio is supposed to be a little different. It's supposed to be a little more, I guess, refined. We're also communicating with the world. We're not, trying to communicate with a truck that's 20 miles up the road or something like that. So we have some restrictions on there. Now, the way I look at it is if you go back and think about what was on TV in the 1970s on broadcast television, you would have a decent idea of what's allowed and not allowed on amateur radio. And so the simple answer is there is no list. Yes, there's a big 7 words or something like that you can't say on the radio that are big problems, especially for broadcasters. But for amateur radio in particular, there's no specific list. It's simply any such language is prohibited. So, careful what you're talking about. Don't be using bad words and things like that. You'll be fine. If you wouldn't talk about it with your kids, you probably shouldn't talk about it on amateur radio. 7. What types of amateur stations can automatically retransmit the signals of other amateur stations? A. Auxiliary, beacon, or earth stations. B. Earth, repeater, or space stations. C. Beacon, repeater, or space stations. Or D. Repeater, auxiliary, or space stations. So let's talk about these a little bit. An auxiliary could just be another hop, somebody just trying to get information to another spot. A beacon is a automatically controlled stations, but it does not transmit other people's signals. It simply sends out maybe a Morse code or some other message for amateur radio to hear, oftentimes used to check how the bands. Earth station, I'm not sure exactly what they mean by that. Just it's not the Earth station. So Earth repeater. Now a repeater, and we'll talk more about these. I'll do a video in a couple weeks on repeaters and basic technician operation. But a repeater is a tower. There's some sort of radio, and when you hit your button PTT and you're on the frequency that the repeater's on, and you have a special PL tone configured in your radio, when you hit that button and you talk into it, it immediately, that repeater is sending the signal out further for you. That is allowed. That's definitely a thing here. So the correct answer is D, repeater, auxiliary, or space station. 8. In which of the following circumstances may the control operator of an amateur station receive compensation for operating that station? A. When the communication is related to the sale of amateur equipment by the control operator's employer. B. When the communication is incidental to classroom instruction at an educational institution. C. When the communication is made to obtain emergency information for a local broadcast station. Or D. All of these choices are correct. So, without getting too deep into this question, the correct answer is B. When it's incidental to classroom instruction at an educational institution. So maybe helping a teacher, and you're teaching amateur radio, and you're the teacher and you're getting paid to be there and you're teaching them that. That's sort of incidental. You're not getting paid to do the class, to do amateur radio. You're there to instruct the classroom. So kind of giving you a pass there for it. 9. When When may an amateur stations transmit information supported broadcasting, program production, or news gathering, assuming no other means is available? A. When such communications are directly related to the immediate safety of human life or protection of property. B. When broadcasting communications to or from the space shuttle. C. Where non-commercial programming is gathered and supplied exclusively to the National Public Radio Network. Or D. Never. Again, just kind of one of these things you have to know, and it's a big one. Um, you're allowed to get involved in this stuff when it is all about the direct, immediate safety of human life or protection of property. When someone's life is in danger, and to some extent property, anything goes, especially human life. Anytime human life is in danger, it's pretty much all bets are off. You can pretty much get away with anything as long as you're trying to save your life or somebody else's life. Um, any other time, nope, you gotta follow the rules no matter what. 10. How does the FCC define broadcasting for the amateur radio service? A. Two-way transmissions by amateur stations. B. Any transmission made by the licensed station. C. Transmission of messages directed only to amateur operators. Or D. Transmissions intended for reception by the general public. So we talked about this a little bit earlier. Broadcasting is all about there's no target. So two-way transmissions, that's a target. That means one person's talking to another person, so they're targeting each other. Any transmission made by the licensed station. So obviously if you're licensed, you're doing a lot of two-way communication. You're calling out CQ to try to make contact with another licensed amateur. But you're not doing it for the general public. You're doing it for yourself and for the other amateurs. C. Transmission of messages directed only to amateur operators. Again, those transmissions are not about just random targets. You have a specific target. You may not always know your specific target yet, but as soon as you find them, you got them. And D. Transmissions intended for reception by the general public. That's the key. The general public is the key. If you're trying to just go out there just so anybody can listen, then you're technically broadcasting. 11. When may an amateur station transmit without identifying on the air? When the transmissions are of a brief nature to make station adjustments. B. When the transmissions are unmodulated. C. When the transmitted power level is below 1 watt. Or D. When transmitting signals to control model craft. So at any time when you're doing basic phone operations, you're not allowed to not give out your call sign. So that pretty much eliminates everything but one. And you are allowed to transmit signals to control model craft, including like space stations, without sending out your call sign. That is simply the one key that you have to remember, is that if you're sending it out to control model craft, don't need your call sign, even though it doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't. I mean, if you have a way to get Morse code your call sign out, you should probably try doing that. Alright, so we've been through all the questions. So now let's go through them one more time. I'm just going to read them, give you a few seconds, and give you the answer. Alright, let's begin. With which countries are FCC licensed amateur radio stations prohibited from exchanging communications? A. Any country whose administration has notified the International Telecommunications Union, ITU, that it objects to such communications. B. Any country whose administration has notified the American Radio Relay League, ARRL, that it objects to such communications. C. Any country banned from such communications by the International Amateur Radio Union, IARU. D. Any country banned from making such communications by the American Radio Relay League. ARRL. The correct answer is A. Any country whose administration has notified the International Telecommunications Union, ITU, that objects to such communications. Under which of the following circumstances are one-way transmissions by an amateur station prohibited? A. In all circumstances. B. Broadcasting. C. International Morse code practice. Or D. Telecommand or transmissions of telemetry. And the correct answer is B. Broadcasting. 3. When is it permissible to transmit messages encoded to obscure their meaning? A. Only during contests. B. Only when transmitting certain approved digital codes. C. Only when transmitting control commands to space stations or radio control craft. Or D. Never. Talked about this a couple times. Only when transmitting control commands to space stations or radio control craft. C. 4. Under what conditions is an amateur station authorized to transmit music using a phone emission? A. When incidental to an authorized retransmission of manned spacecraft communications. B. When the music produces no spurious emissions. C. When transmissions are limited to less than 3 minutes per hour. D. When the music is transmitted above 1280 MHz. And the correct answer is A. When incidental to an authorized retransmission of manned spacecraft communications. 5. When may amateur radio operators use their stations to notify other amateurs of the availability of equipment for sale or trade? A. Never. B. When the equipment is not the personal property of either the station licensee or the control operator or their close relatives. C. When no profit is made on the sale. Or D. When selling amateur radio equipment and not on a regular basis. The correct answer is D. When selling amateur radio equipment and not on a regular basis. C. What, if any, are 6. 6. What, if any, are the restrictions concerning transmission of language that may be considered indecent or obscene? A. The FCC maintains a list of words that are not permitted to be used on amateur frequencies. B. Any such language is prohibited. C. The ITU maintains a list of words that are not permitted to be used on amateur frequencies. Or D. There is no such prohibition. And the correct answer is B. Any such language is prohibited. 7. What types of amateur stations can automatically retransmit the signals of other amateur stations? A. Auxiliary beacon or earth stations. B. Earth, repeater, or space stations. C. Beacon, repeater, or space stations. Or D. Repeater, auxiliary, or space stations. The correct answer is D. Repeater, auxiliary, or space stations. In which of the following circumstances may the control operator of an amateur station receive compensation for operating that station? A. When the communication is related to the sale of amateur equipment by the control operator's employer. B. When the communication is incidental to classroom instruction at an educational institution. C. When the communication is made to obtain emergency information for a local broadcast station. Or D. All these choices are correct. The correct answer is B. When the communication is incidental to classroom instruction at an educational institution. 9. When may amateur stations transmit information in support of broadcasting, program production, or news gathering, assuming no other means is available? A. When such communications are directly related to the immediate safety of human life or protection of property. B. When broadcasting communications to or from the space shuttle. C. Where non-commercial programming is gathered and supplied exclusively to the National Public Radio Network. Or D. Never. The correct answer is A. When such communications are directly related to the immediate safety of human life or protection of property. 10. How does the FCC define broadcasting for the amateur radio service? A. Two-way transmissions by amateur stations. B. Any transmission made by the licensed station. C. Transmission of messages directed only to amateur operators. Or D. Transmissions intended for reception by the general public. And the correct answer is D. Transmissions intended for reception by the general public. 11. Last question. When may an amateur station transmit without identifying on the air? A. When the transmissions are of brief nature to make station adjustments. B. When the transmissions are unmodulated. C. When the transmitted power level is below 1 watt. D. When transmitting signals to control model craft. And the correct answer is D. When transmitting signals to control model craft. Thank you so much for joining me. Welcome to Mayor's Ham Shack. Again, if you have any questions or concerns or just want to leave some feedback, please hit the comments below, hit that like button, and please feel free to subscribe. Look forward to talking to you again soon.